What's good? What's good? So I wanted to talk about something that a lot of people think about, but I know a lot of people are not honest about it, and that's buying property in the Dominican Republic. Now, this is not going to be some theory. This is going to be a real situation that had actually happened to someone who tried to turn a property into an Airbnb investment in Dominican Republic. Because on the surface, I know it sounds like a great idea. You're gonna have, your lower property costs. There's tourism. There's Airbnb. It just sounds like the perfect deal. It's the perfect formula, right? But sometimes what looks good from the outside can turn out to be very different once you're actually inside of the deal. So basically, the situation. This is how this unfolded. So this person decided to buy an apartment in Dominican Republic, but specifically for Airbnb. And their plan was simple. Instead of them buying a regular apartment, they wanted something that could generate income, right? And they contacted a real estate agent and they started looking at properties. And what they wanted was clear. What they wanted was not just any apartment, but they wanted a penthouse with a rooftop, jacuzzi, the whole thing. And the reason was simple because a regular apartment in Santiago, it might go for $40, $80 a night, something like that, depending on the location and the condition. But a penthouse with all the extra things, amenities that go with it, you can rent it out on Airbnb from anywhere to $80 to $125 a night, depending on the season and what the demand is. So the search had began, and eventually the real estate agent had found the right property for him. It was a penthouse that fit exactly what he was looking for. Now, at that point, the process had moved forward. The paperwork had started, the bank had got involved, and the bank had gave him a specific instruction. And they told him that he needed to increase his movement in his bank account so that way it will look like he actually handled larger amounts of money so he can, make the purchase and go through the bank. So, in other words, the bank wanted to see that financial activity. They wanted to see that this person was financially stable. So, he started doing that, started moving money through the account so the bank can see consistent activity in the account. And at first, the bank approved him for half the amount that he had needed for that apartment. They told him to keep the account active for another month, and then they would review it again to see how much they can approve him for. And basically, the goal was to qualify for a loan where he would only need to put down 10%. Now, eventually, the loan was approved. Everything was moving forward. And then the closing day had arrived for the apartment. Now, this is when something changed everything about the deal because the monthly payment was revealed for the first time on the day of the closing. Now, if he had known the real payment before that moment, he probably would have walked away. But by the time you actually reach closing, most people are already committed to the deal, committed to the property. So he had asked them why was his payment so high? And the bank had explained something to him that not a lot of people know. And this is the point of this video, so that way I can give y'all this information. So the bank that he used was Banreservas. And Banreservas has a rule. Banreserva. I gotta say it like that, like Spanish. Banreserva. But they only finance a property until the buyer reaches 62 years old. So what they do is they calculate the loan term based on the buyer's age. So, for example, if someone is 60 years old and the bank, or you're trying to get a loan through the bank, that bank may only finance the property for that 2 years. So, with that said, that changed the amount of his monthly payment. So, in that situation, the loan term ended up being much shorter than what he had expected. which meant that the monthly payment was obviously much higher than he thought it was going to be. But at that point, the papers were already done. Everything was on the table, so the deal had went through. Now, after the purchase, the apartment was furnished and then it was listed on Airbnb. The location has seemed perfect. Again, this was in Santiago de los Caballeros, right behind one of the largest hospitals in Latin America. And the idea was simple. People travel from different parts of the country to that hospital. Some come for their surgeries, some come for, pregnancy. Some people come to visit their family members and whatnot. And many of them need a place to stay that's nearby. And for a while, the idea had worked for them. The apartment got bookings from people visiting that hospital. Some came for their medical procedures, others were visiting their relatives, and people that were traveling from other cities would rent the apartment for a few days while, they handled their hospital visits. But then something had changed. And at that time, the hospital had only completed its first phase. They were still building the second phase. But what no one thought about was that the second phase would include something else, a hotel. And the moment that hotel opened up, everything had changed for him immediately, right on the spot. Now, visitors to the hospital had the option to stay inside the hospital complex itself. That meant there was fewer people that actually needed an Airbnb. But the truth is, the Airbnb honestly was already starting to go down at that time anyway, So the owner had decided to just sell that apartment. They listed it on social media through a real estate contact, and eventually they have found a buyer for it. And that's basically where this larger lesson, comes in. What this video, I'm trying to get to you through this video. Because this situation shows you a major difference between buying a property in Dominican Republic and buying a property in the United States. When people buy property in the Dominican Republic, the first question they ask is usually how much money will I have to send every month to keep this property. But in the United States, investors usually ask a different question altogether. They ask, how much will this property produce, or how much will I make off of this property every single month? Especially if the property is like a multifamily building, like different apartment units and stuff. Like you might rent out one unit and then you might live in another, or rent both units and just generate extra income. In some cases, the rent from the property can even cover, your housing expenses somewhere else. So, with that said, I'm trying to say that in the Dominican Republic, that type of scenario is rare. It's extremely hard. And in most cases, the rental income won't even cover your mortgage payment. The only way it really works is if the property is purchased cash money, efectivo, with a large down payment, so the loan balance is actually small. Otherwise, the rent, it usually doesn't even cover the bank payment you got to make every month. Now, another factor in that is the currency, because you might invest a lot of money in the Dominican Republic, but the income you receive is usually in Dominican peso dominicano. And in this particular situation, Airbnb payments, they did come in with, US dollars, so that actually helps. But if someone rents the property long term, they're usually going to pay in peso dominicano, which means that the investor is exposed to the currency changes as well. So imagine the situation, right? You're living in the United States, but every month you're sending money to the Dominican Republic to cover a property that you're not even living in. Sometimes a tenant is living there, sometimes it's empty, And when it's empty, your expenses still continue. That don't stop, your mortgage payments still go. Your electricity, your water, your maintenance fees, your internet, your Netflix, your HBO Max, Hulu. Even when the apartment has no guests, you still have those costs. So I know a lot of people, they get frustrated, from that experience. And, for example, electricity bills, they can arrive even when the property has been closed for weeks, right? And in some cases, the bill doesn't even reflect what the actual meter reading is. And situations like that add like another layer of stress to owning a property from another country. So, what I'm trying to basically say, the lesson of this video here is that buying a property in Dominican Republic is always a bad idea if you're trying to do an Airbnb, right? Um, it doesn't leave what people try to make it out to be. It can make sense if you're planning to live there, if you're trying to retire there, or if you're going to use, the property personally. But buying property strictly, as an investment while living somewhere else can be real complicated, more complicated than people expect. And that's the part that most people don't actually see. And it's why some investors eventually decide that they would rather invest where they actually live or just invest in the United States if they're able to travel there. Because managing a property in another country comes with risks that aren't always in your face or obvious at the beginning. So if someone is thinking about, buying a property in Dominican Republic, purely as an investment, it's worth looking at the full picture before making that decision. Because sometimes the investment that looks great on paper turns out to be something completely different in real life.